We did that last month when we had Ron Hampton from the commission with us, and I think that's really helpful, where he was able to sort of share kind of things either from the commission or directly from himself, and sort of differentiate the hats he was wearing, or the voices and viewpoints he was representing. So I think that'll be great to have. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to put in the chat a link to our Google Doc. We started some notes last month where it's just some borrowed information from the police reform website and the Facebook group. And last month did a bit of an overview of sort of like what the Police Reform Commission is. So we'd love to start off with just some introductions to get a sense of who's here in the Zoom room. And then we'll turn it over to our Police Reform Commission members, Samantha Davis, and oh, we lost Mark. Mark, are you in the wrong meeting? Who was Mark? He never identified himself. Bob, do you know who Mark was?
I don't know who Mark is now.
Okay. All right. So Bob and I can introduce ourselves, and then we'll turn it over to Samantha Davis and Kent Bass to each share sort of the key questions that I sent over. So just if you can introduce yourselves and then share with us how you came to be a part of the commission. So if you were invited or advocated to be part of it, or whatever that story might be. And then what this concept of police reform means to you, either personally or professionally, as you're serving on the commission. And then we'll just have a conversation, again, continuing from last month, really wanting to know how community members can either be aware of or get involved in the process that you all are working on in terms of creating recommendations to deliver to the council, and open to anything else people want to discuss. Does that sound okay? Great. Hi, Anne. Thanks for joining. We just got started a couple minutes ago, so you haven't missed anything, and we're just going to kick off with introductions. If you want to go first and share your name, where you live, and what brings you to the meeting this month. And you're on mute. There we go.
So often my cursor goes nuts. Hi, I'm Ann Hoffman. I live at 14th and Kenyon, been here 4 years, and I have been absolutely convinced that the police are not going to behave until we make them. And so I'm concerned.
Thanks, Anne. Bob, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I know Anne and Kent already, and you guys are pretty familiar with my work. Samantha, it's really cool to meet you and get to talk with you tonight. Your reputation precedes you. I'm the senior advisor for Will Merrifield's campaign, and talking to Will and his team, Caitlin Kachalova, and others around them, as well as Tracy Red, Black Lives Matter, April, and all of them. So it's really cool to know about Black Swan Academy, know about your work. You're one of the names on the Police Reform Commission that gave me some hope in the process. The 4 or 5 of you that I was like, all right, cool, there are people in this space right now that will speak on my values and the work I do. So I'm really excited just to meet you tonight and hear more about how Layla and myself can be a resource to you within our own community, within Columbia Heights, within ANC 1A, and then obviously Kent as part of that commission. We can do a lot, and we reach out to a lot of the community members. We're really tapped in. So I'm really excited to learn more about you, your work, and then hopefully let you be a leader to us as we move forward.
I forgot to mention one thing, which is I do work with a philanthropist, and I want him to learn about Black Swan Academy.
Yeah, cool.
Thanks, Anne and Bob. So my name's Layla Bonneau. I am an ANC commissioner in Columbia Heights, 14th to 16th Street Northwest, Ogden to Spring Road, finishing up my first term and running for re-election. And I'm unopposed. So I'm excited to continue this work for at least a couple more years here in the community. And I co-lead this committee with Angelica Castagnon, another 1A commissioner. And I think top of mind right now is Karan Hilton's death and the protests and the violence that we've seen MPD administer once again against peaceful protesters. And so just keeping that present in our conversation tonight, that we may see laws and policy change happen, but then if it's not actually implemented, there is that lag time. And what Anne referenced earlier, there seems to be this, like, we know there is this entire system that needs to change. So and we had another neighbor join, so we'll let Rose connect to audio. Hi, Rose.
Hey, how is everyone?
We are
People looking pretty serious. What's the story here?
Hey.
We are just finishing up introductions before we hear from our Police Reform Commission members. So Rose, if you would like to introduce yourself and where you live and what brings you to this month's meeting, that would be great.
I'm Rose Schneider. I'm an international public health advisor. Can you see me? You can't see me?
No,
Yeah.
You have a lovely headshot up, but we don't see you live.
I look better in the, can't start the video. Let's select another video camera setting. Start the video. Web camera. Don't know why. It says it can't start. All of my technologies do not work. Anyway, I'm Rose Schneider. I live on Perry Place, 1414, right off of 14th Street. And I'm a international public health advisor, and I work in climate change. And I've been in this neighborhood, in this house for 32 years. And I love the neighborhood. I've seen a lot of changes. I miss some of my old neighbors, but I certainly welcome the new ones. And I feel like I want to be involved in many of the things that are going on, both at the very local level and then across the city. And I don't have an official title.
I mean, active neighbor, enthused community activist. I think we can just help you come up with the title.
Well, I think I'm Rose is the title. Like everybody knows Rose.
True. All right. So thank you, neighbors, for those introductions. Samantha, hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of who's on the call tonight, and would love to start with you to introduce yourself and share how you came to be a part of the commission and what police reform means to you, or whatever else you might want to share in the opening remarks.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for the invitation. Great to meet each and every one of you all. Before I jump in, curious to know for Bob and Rose, can you all share your pronouns?
He and his.
Okay.
She and her.
Thank you. And I asked you all specifically only because I see everyone else has them
Yeah.
in their name. I appreciate that. And also want to acknowledge that I have this background of, and I might be going in and out of Zoom because I am in my hometown, Pittsburgh, in my mother's house, my childhood home. And sometimes things happen and get loud or have random things happen in the background. So please forgive me if I have to go off on mute at any point or have to step away. But so great to be here. Really appreciate the invitation and feel welcome. Oftentimes I don't know what type of environment I'm gonna walk into when we start talking about policing and police reform. And it definitely seems like we are among people who are committed and dedicated to, at the very least, police reform, and hopefully in my case, really at least curious about how we divest from police and reimagine safety and true safety. And so I am the executive director and the founder of Black Swan Academy. Black Swan Academy for the past 2.5 years have been pushing one of our Black youth agendas called Love Us, Don't Harm Us. Initially, when we first started that agenda, the young people were focused really specifically on the investment portion of safety and investing in mental health professionals and recognizing that as an alternative to various forms of the school to prison pipeline, suspensions, expulsions, police presence in schools. And we're really focusing on the investment piece, calling on City Council to put more money in the budget for mental health supports, supporting things like violence interruption and the NARE Act. And consistently over the past 2.5 years, what we were met with was there's not enough pie to go around to be able to support these investments that we were calling for. There wasn't enough funds in our budget to be able to invest radically in the things that young people knew that they needed. However, each year that we were actively doing mental health work, there was an investment in policing. And so young people from starting January of this past year, right before the uprising, before the pandemic, before George Floyd, made an explicit call to both invest in all resources and experts that create a safer, healthier, more equitable learning environment, and to divest from all forms of policing and criminalization, including removing police from schools. And that also included more broadly the policing infrastructure that goes along with that. So the metal detectors, the various surveillance efforts, and other practices and policies that does not allow schools to feel like a sanctuary, or at the very least, a place where young people can learn in a safe environment. So we moved forward with that work, had a pretty robust police-free, and still have a pretty robust police-free schools campaign. That campaign is a part of the larger call for defunding MPD. We see the removing police from schools and police-free schools as an abolitionist framework, and believe that schools are a microcosm of our society. And so if schools can exist, and we believe they can and know they can because we've seen it all around us, if schools can exist without police, and if schools can exist with the resources they need to keep each other safe, then we know our community can exist without police as well. And so we're working closely, all the folk you named, Bob, with BLM and Stop Police Terror Project. I know Kelvin has been involved a lot with them, as well as BYP 100 around efforts to defund MPD, with Black Swan Academy and youth leaders all across DC and all across this country, calling for both the removal of police in schools and the radical investments and reimagination of our learning environment. We come to this commission because despite the 15,000 people who testified and submitted testimony in support of defund MPD and or police-free schools, the council did not remove police from schools. And it is my opinion that they did very little in terms of defunding MPD as a whole. Instead, what they did, some of the more I would say more conservative members created the Police Reform Commission. And a part of that commission eventually ended up having one of the scopes being to analyze whether or not we should have police in schools, and to make recommendations for the council. And so while Black Swan Academy was against the Police Reform Commission, since it was happening, we did create kind of a framework that we believe that commission should go by, and that included having an anti-racist training, which as a commission we are working on. That included centering the voices of young people and organizations that work with young people. And so I was invited by Chairman Mendelson to serve on the commission. It took me a while to answer that invitation. Had a lot of reservations, and this is like public knowledge, had a lot of reservations about joining the commission, and still really curious to see what can come out of it. Absolutely believing as an organizer that nothing is going to get done without continued organizing and pressure and building power from the community. But am hopeful at this point, am hopeful that the commission will be a tool where organizers can continue to agitate, and hopefully will put out recommendations that support the work that Black organizers have been doing in the city for forever, to move that forward. I think at this point, so I am hopeful for that now. I don't think it's going to be, I would love for it to be a complete like roadmap to defund. I am more hopeful that there is going to be a recommendation to remove police from schools. Not sure what's happening in other committees, but regardless, I think that this is going to be probably a more progressive, for lack of a better term, recommendation coming out the commission than people expected, that some of the council members expected, which means that we will still need community to ensure that these recommendations just aren't sitting on someone's desk, whether it's Chairman Mendelson's desk or Mayor Bowser's desk, before anything gets done. So that's where I'm at.
Thanks,
So if it wasn't
Samantha.
clear, I do not think reform works. I'm not sitting on this commission for reform. I think Chief Newsom actually very well shows us that police reform doesn't work, and his standard, if anyone has seen it, his standard like MPD presentation, he talks about the dedicated 20 years of efforts that the MPD has put into reform. I think that is just proof, and very needed proof, that reform doesn't work. If 20 years later, we're still at a place where violence is increasing, and where we have Deontay and Karan Hilton in a matter of weeks dying at the hands of MPD and interrogating and harassing protesters. So that's where I'm at, that's where I'm coming from.
Thanks, Samantha. I really appreciate that. And we will have time for robust Q&A and discussion. I know I have lots of thoughts, and really happy to have you here tonight. But first we will hear from Kent Bates, Chair of ANC 1A, and similarly, just introducing yourself, how you came to be on the commission, and what police reform means to you.
Just before we do, I want to apologize. I'm making dinner. I'm here.
You should absolutely feed yourself.
We'll all come over.
So what's for dinner, Anne?
It's a big dinner. It's bean curd, mushrooms, and bok choy on soupy noodles. And I started making it last night. I cut up the bok choy. So
Enjoy.
and come on over. I have a balcony where we can sit.
Thanks, Umi.
Love it. So, sure, let's get. I'll dive in. And thank you for the opportunity. It's interesting to be on the hot seat before the commission versus running the meeting. So that's actually kind of nice. As far as how I got on the commission, I will be frank, I hadn't really given it any thought. I certainly wasn't asking to be on the commission. I was actually a little I was surprised. The first I'd heard about it was when Anita Bonds had given me a phone call and said that she'd put my name forward and that she implored me to say yes when Chairman Mendelson called me. So of course I did. I know that there were a lot of people who requested, once the commission was being formed, there were a lot of people that asked if they could join it. And that was one path for becoming a member. But as I understand it, the council gave Chairman Mendelson full authority to pick and choose from their recommendations, whether people advocated on behalf of themselves or if somebody else put their name forward. So from that perspective, I'll be very honest, I really hadn't been thinking too much about reform. I know that we have this committee and I've kind of relied on Bob and Calvin and Lila and Angelica to make recommendations for where they think that the commission needs to go, because you guys have been doing good work in that space. But as far as what reform means to me, I think it's been kind of a process for me, where, you know, if you ask me at the very beginning, I think reform is pretty clear. And I think it's kind of clear from the council that if they're creating a police reform commission, they're presuming that there will be recommendations to perhaps change police practices. At least that's what the wording suggests to me. As far as what needs to happen with public safety, I think that's actually a different conversation. Based on the years of service in our community and the conversations we've had, I will say, like, things that have been consistently frustrating to me, if I can hyper focus on a couple of areas, for instance, that the types of things we see at the Columbia Heights Plaza, one might be able to consider them nuisance issues. One could definitely label some of them as social service, behavioral health, addiction. We have a host of issues that can be related to a number of locations in our community. Are they public safety issues per se? I think at some level, it's the safety of the individual that should be of primary concern, but are they creating unsafe communities to us as a whole? I don't think they are. And I don't really think that the first responders should be MPD when there's a call for service. Like, that's, to me, a huge problem. I think the issue we've seen with our street vendors, where because of the laws we have in place and what happens when there's a call for service and a member of MPD shows up, like, that's the wrong response to the issue. And you know, we can go down that road on a number of issues. So because of that, you know, and maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but, you know, we have 5 committees within the Reform Commission, and we were all, I think we all had some input. We got to express our preference for what commissions we wanted to join based on the issues under the umbrella. And so the two, and we all got to choose 2 of the 5 committees. So there's no rest for any of us. But so I'm kind of on the building up non-police responses to social problems, as well as reforms to MPD practices, forced stops, searches, recruitment, and training. I thought those 2 kind of matched some of the, shall I say, the experiences I've had in our community and some of the strengths I had with regards to process and organization. And I certainly didn't want to get overly involved in areas where I mean, there's 20 people on this commission and we have so much expertise in so many areas. You know, let the people with the expertise and passion in many of these other areas, let them bring forward some really great recommendations, and I would play to my strengths. So that's what I'm doing. So I guess like right now I'm looking a little bit like alternatives to 911 calls when MPD. I know we have a couple of cities that are looking at alternatives to when there's a call for service. Should it even be MPD that shows up? What's the alternative? I don't know, Samantha, I don't know if you were able to participate in the police stop series that was there, but I thought it was a great series where it was kind of a seminar over 7 different sessions over a week and a half, where the question of what triggers a police stop, should we be having police stops, are there better alternatives to police stops? It was very insightful, and we really got into some meaningful, which also means somewhat uncomfortable conversations, but that was the goal. And you really do come away with it at asking yourself, do many of these stops even need to occur, for one, and two, recognizing that even making a 911 call is a privilege, that many people don't have that as an opportunity. So it's not just, and that a 911 call can actually trigger a series of events, each one of which may have some bias into it, that then really changes the outcome, which is nothing, well, one would hope is not what the original intent was. So that was, I thought, an excellent experience with some great dialogue and expertise and experts from across the country. One thing that I also am looking at is, because one of the committees I'm on deals with recruitment and I said recruitment, oversight, accountability, recruitment and training. I've been looking to see if we have any best practices documentation. And I just want to be clear, that doesn't mean that I presume it is best practices, but I'd like to see in the recruitment process what currently are, when there's a new hire or recruitment, what does MPD consider to be a best practices? And then is there a way to tear it apart and say, I understand what you think you're doing, but this is leading to why we don't have the right people in the right places, right? So like see if there's a way to flip it on its head and say, I get that when you're coming from a very organized top-down structure that you think this is the right way to do it, but I don't necessarily know if that's getting you the right skill sets for the kind of public safety we expect in our communities. And so I think for me and many things is I kind of look at it with, what are we currently using for our metrics? And are we measuring the right things? And is it really the wrong thing that we're doing to begin with? Like, is it so deeply rooted? And the answer is probably yes. But is it so deeply rooted that many of the things you're taking for granted that get you the raw recruit to the person showing up when there's a call for service because of a street vendor? Is it just so totally flawed that you need to get rid of those practices and start from someplace else? So I guess I ramble on quite a bit, and I apologize for that. But I also look at this very much as a conversation. I've tried to come at this with having a very open mind and doing a lot of listening and learning and hopefully growing, because I know that I agree with a lot of what I've heard, that what we're doing right now is not working. And it seems like there's a lot of, for lack of a better thing, it seems like the dog continues to chase its tail, but we're not getting anywhere.
Thanks, Kent. And Rose, welcome back. Sorry, we lost you there for a little bit. Rose, I think you have this link from before, but I will drop the notes document back in there just in case. And we are recording tonight if you need that later as well.
I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, well, thank you both for that. I'm happy to kick off with the first question, and then would love to hear from other community members about any thoughts or questions that Samantha and Kent's remarks might have sparked with you all. So when we met with Ron last month, I think the commission had only met once, and then there was like an emergency meeting as well. And so my question is, when you have a commission that's made up of people kind of all along the police reform spectrum, what norms or conversations have you all had about the way you all will negotiate developing these recommendations and presenting this as essentially one voice from one commission, knowing that there are very different viewpoints around what reform or abolition looks like around MPD?
Am I the next person to speak, or is it Bob?
So I think this question is for Samantha and Kent, and then Rose would love to hear from you if you have a question or comment for the panelists, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks.
So I will say, and from where I'm sitting, we haven't had any intentional conversation around values and norms, like a facilitated conversation around values and norms. We briefly, I think the first or the second meeting, not the special meeting, the emergency meeting for Deon K, we did talk a bit about kind of our procedures and how we would move forward, but it hasn't been laid out as a full commission quite yet, how we are going to produce our final recommendations. We are, from what I imagine will happen at this point, is that many of those recommendations are going to get probably to a near final point in the subcommittees. And as a commission, it does seem what Kent mentioned in terms of like respecting the various expertise who are on the commission and the subcommittees they chose. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of those decisions get made in the subcommittee and we bring it to the commission for kind of like deliberation and questions. And if people have like hard no's or objections, then we'll create space for that. But at this point, I'm really curious to hear your interpretation of things, Kent, because it hasn't felt like there's been a lot of intentionality as a full commission around the recommendations, and it's November. I imagine that most of that is going to happen in the subcommittees.
Yeah,
Thanks, Samantha. Kent?
I agree with Samantha, and I will say that I personally have a lot of concern about the timeline. I recognize that the sooner we can get recommendations out, the better, because they should have happened years ago anyway. But I also am concerned that I don't want this to be pro forma. I think there's real work that needs to happen here. I don't want us to have to submit like a final report on December 31st, knowing full well that we haven't gotten the work done. That would be concerning to me. And as far as conversations within the committees I'm on, one of the things I suggested, which seems to, people seem to really like, is I kind of made a comment that maybe we should be trying to develop something similar to the comprehensive plan, but for police reform, where the model document that we should be working towards should define the problems, define the goals, define the aspirations, perhaps include policies that we need to have as a city with regards to public safety, include actual action items. And one of the reasons why I was thinking about this, and maybe it's the wonkiness part of me, but in order to speak with one voice, to me, the final document that goes to the council has to be broken out in such a way where things that are very clear. This needs to be done. It needs to have the action item. Like, this is something we've all spoken with in one voice. Things where maybe we can't get to consensus, but we do have consensus that it needs to be addressed. It needs to be in there too, but maybe and have the room where we can continue to have this conversation. And I also would really like it where, because public safety, in a perfect world, we could solve everything that needs to be solved. But there's enough of a realist in me that says, I could see where we could put forward a lot of great policies, recommendations. The council may not adopt them, and we might be right back with putting another commission together in the future. Wouldn't it be nice if a future commission didn't have to start from nothing like we are? Like that really bothers me. Like it's like none of these issues are new. A lot of these conversations have been going on in the community for years, yet we were essentially handed a bag of nothing and said, this is an important issue. All of you really talented people, figure it out. And in 2 months, let us know what you think. Well, that's really a recipe for nothing. I mean, I'm thrilled that they finally were able to secure impact justice to help us do the research and pull things together. But we've only had impact justice helping us now for about a week. The committee itself meets on a monthly basis. We decided for the 2 committees I'm on that we're meeting every other week, because we know we need the freedom to actually dig into things and do research. But we also need to make sure that we keep each other going by reporting in on a regular basis. And every week is too much because there's not enough time to actually pull it together. But maybe now with impact justice, there is. So, Samantha, I don't know how you feel, but I feel like for the amount of work, for the amount of time we've been given to do real meaningful work, I don't feel that we've really had the resources we needed until recently to really get started. And I don't want this to be a sham. I don't want this to be pro forma. I don't want this to be someone's political talking point in a couple of months. I want real outcomes that make us a safer place. And so that's where I'm coming from. But, and then the last thing I'll say is I also want to create I would like some kind of framework where, if it takes longer for us to get to solutions or recommendations on some issues, I don't want that holding us up from moving recommendations forward that are just very, very clear cut, right? Like, they should be allowed to move on different trajectories so that we can continue to work on this. And I'd say one thing I would love to see, and maybe police reform is the wrong word, but I would love to see some kind of body move forward instead of having a terminus or an end date. But I'd love to see it move forward, because I think many of the issues that are being supposedly being addressed in this commission, I think these are ongoing issues. And I think as we learn more, as the city takes perhaps a stronger interest in actual reform versus wallpaper reform, it would be nice if there was an ongoing group that could continue to feed recommendations to the council and push them to continually make this a better city. And I'll hush. You give me a soapbox, I'll talk forever.
Thanks, Kent. Samantha, anything you want to respond to on that?
Yeah, me and Kent might be it might not be a good coupling of me and Kent, because also I love soapboxes too. And I'm going to want to respond every time you say something, even if for most of what I heard, I agree with. So I'm just going to lift up a couple of things that you already said. I do believe that, and I brought it up when we were going over the procedures, and we haven't revisited that conversation, but I do imagine that there are going to be recommendations that's going to take more work, and do not think December 30th is enough time for those recommendations. However, at the same time, I believe there are concrete recommendations that we could make now. There are, well, as commissioners, some of us are new to this work. Some of us have been doing this work for years, for decades, in some cases. But the organizers on the ground, right, there's already recommendations that exist. There's already like solid recommendations, both for investments, reforms, divestments, like the whole gamut that exists for each of these committees. And I do believe that we as a commission will be doing that work a disservice if we don't like move forward quickly on pushing those recommendations out. And by quickly, I think some of this stuff should have been done and rolled up in the comprehensive police reform and justice amendment act that already happened. And so one of the frustrations that I had coming into a commission is just, right, you have to deal with bureaucracy and things move slowly, and they are definitely moving slower than I would like. But do believe that there are opportunities to push recommendations out ASAP, and that it seems like it might be beneficial, thinking as an organizer, it might be beneficial to have this additional space, whether it's still the commission or what have you, this additional space to continue to push recommendations forward as things come out, as things progress. But for a lot of these things, we know the answer.
Thanks, Samantha. Rose, I know you were trying to get in earlier. Do you have a question or a comment for either our speakers or the group?
Just a few things. I had said in the last meeting that, you know, we shouldn't be just thinking that we're going to ask them not to kill us or beat us, that they are our servants and they are paid by us and directed by us to help us. And I have done 30 years of evaluating programs, and what I see is the point at which there is pressure on police to perform the way they are is by the unions, if I understand correctly, and by peers and by the structure. And unless we deal with those things that allow these police to continue to act as they are, we can talk all we want. But I was told in meetings that the reason the police do not walk the beat, they do not get out of their cars, they are not held responsible when they beat and kill people, is because unions defend them. So we probably should focus a bit on that. And we should look at the transparency for everything that's done so that we have information about that. My second point is that it is all well and good to have police-free schools and other actions, but my experience in 32 years here is that this city does not have an approach that can respond to the needs that are not responded to by police. And I can say across the street, we have a major issue, and there is no one who is 24 hours. And I've worked as a consultant to the city. I think if we are going to say that we don't want police to respond, we have to be very clear about the lack of capability right now for agencies to have a response mechanism that is functional. And that there's coordination across these agencies to make that happen. And it does not exist. I guess that was pretty strong words, but.
No, Rose, I appreciate you speaking your mind. So Samantha or Kent, if you.
I agree with every single thing you said. The police union is an extremely powerful force in the city and across the country. That the police contract is in process now with reviewing and finalizing their contract, and the same organizers you see calling for defund and calling for police-free schools are the same organizers and others who are on top of this collective bargaining agreement with policing in the city. That is a huge part of it. Even Chief Newsom has said that he hasn't been able to fire bad cops because of the contract, the union contract that they have. So that's a huge part of it. I'm not sure if, I would imagine maybe the Police Accountability Subcommittee is looking at that. But absolutely agree, we need to get ahead of that. And Chairman Allen did say that one of the reasons, with the exception, in addition to the CFA not approving a budget that cut MPD dollars further, that another reason that he was having difficulty was because of that contract. So a lot of truth in that. The other piece I would just add when it comes to police-free schools is, again, absolutely agree. And reminding folk that when we're coming from an abolitionist framework, the point of abolition is not just the divestment piece or the dismantling of the problematic oppressive system. In fact, that is just the very tip of the iceberg. The point of it is this opportunity to birth and reimagine a new world that does not exist yet, right? And so that infrastructure that you're absolutely correct when it comes to all of the things that we need for true safety does not exist in the city, and probably not in many places in this country. And so we believe, and one of the approaches, and there's many strategies, but we do believe that one of the strategies needs to be a divestment from and a deprioritization of policing and the policing infrastructure, so that we can redirect those funds and invest and build all of those infrastructures that few people would argue will bring us safety. Like, most people agree that, yeah, police are responding to trauma, police are responding to social needs. Most people agree with that. It is the fear of what happens in this interim with this divestment and investment that people can't push past. So yes, agree, horrible infrastructure, but also I think a clear priority of the city leadership thus far, and for the past at least 15 years, if not more, of prioritizing building up a policing infrastructure and defunding all of those social initiatives and social infrastructure
But
that
where,
has left us where we are.
excuse me, but do we see at all that the different offices and departments within the Department of Health, the Department of Mental Health Services, addiction, or any of those are even beginning to think about, if they got money, that they would respond and coordinate the services that are badly needed for children in schools, or alcoholics on the plazas, or any of these things? I mean, I think that's what ties into the fear of people. I don't fear it, but that ties into the fear of people is, we take the police out, there is no one. And right now, there is not a force that would respond 24 hours a day to these social service needs. It is not existent. It needs to be built. But to think that we're going to just build it overnight without the council and the agencies stepping up in a major way, it's not going to happen. It has to happen. That's the alternative to police and nightsticks.
Well, if I can jump in a little. You're absolutely right, Rose, especially with the 24/7 focus, because that was something that we discussed a bit when we were talking about police stops. And I know that in the District of Columbia, for instance, one thing that we've always, as from wearing the commissioner hat, is we've always known about the Office of Behavioral Health, and we've been trying to reach out to them when appropriate as an alternative to MPD. Yet we also know that when we've advocated in the past that they don't have enough, I mean, essentially they have two people that well, at least a couple of years ago, they only had 2 people that would respond throughout the city. Like that's a joke, right? I mean, that we know that we have a lot of behavioral health issues across the city, and that we're relying on 2 staffers. And I think that their office is slightly larger than that. So when I would talk to them and say, well, could we advocate for increasing your budget, increasing your staff in the next budget oversight hearings? And they're like, well, yeah, no, we would love that, but we don't even have the capacity to accept them. So, you know, I think that we have a lot of alternatives to MPD or police that just don't have the support infrastructure or ability to go 24/7. And some of the groups or agencies, or however you want to define it, they just don't even exist yet, right? Because that the city has not put a priority on that as a response. I think you could get 13 council members that would probably say that's a great thing, but the words don't always follow or shall we say, the actions don't always follow the words. So, and I think that's something that we need to help amplify in our recommendations, right? Because, like even some, like, not quite, but it's sort of related to public safety, but not as core. But I brought this up at our earlier ANC meeting when Commissioner Brown wanted to introduce a resolution supporting the Crown Act. The thing that sticks in my craw is that time and time again, the Office of Human Rights is often used as the, shall we say, the watchdog agency for when human rights are being violated. Yet every single year, they don't get additional staff, they don't get additional funding. We just see year after year legislation introduced and passed that just kind of without even thought says, and the Office of Human Rights will take care of that. Well, you can't just keep piling on agencies that are already overextended, and that needs to be a big part of it. Is even where we do have the agencies or the staffing that are focused on many of these issues, we keep piling on. We don't increase funding. We don't increase staffing, and they aren't 24/7. So you have an issue at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night. The only response is going to be MPD, even if that's the wrong response. And we got to break that.
I'm sorry, just one comment. I think that unfortunately, many of the agencies think that their job is 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I think there'll have to be a real change in the mentality and in the responsibility of these agencies. If you gave them more money, they still want to work. They want to come in with their briefcases at 9 and leave at 5, because they know that the EMTs and the police are there. I think it'll take a sea change of mentality within the entire city's bureaucracy to think that you can't just fix these things at 9 in the morning.
Thanks, Rose. I
Sorry.
want to give Bob a chance to ask a question, and then we can go to Anne as well.
Well, yeah. Well, I just wanted to maybe reflect on a few things that I'm learning through this process and continue to learn. And I would really love Samantha's thoughts, because I'm sure she's thought about things I'm just coming to. On one side of things, it's kind of the long-term learning that I go through as a white male in America, a tall white male in America, from the Midwest. And the thing I'm really learning is I give the benefit of the doubt to the state, benefit of the doubt to the police, benefit of the doubt to my council member, benefit of the doubt to the system, that it wants to be reformed, that people are really trying their best and they are going back to the classroom to draw on the chalkboard and go to the museum. And I do really trust that, like, Councilmember Nadeau cares about the people more than she cares about the developers that bankroll her campaigns. And I give them the benefit of the doubt. And I come back, and then every time I'm like, oh shit, like that was all, none of this was actually happening. Nobody was trying to reform. And so the question looking ahead on that is one thing. And then my short-term learning here in Washington, DC, and being with the family and community with Karan Hilton last night at the 4th District. And to be around those young people, to be around this community now for 6-7 years, and to be at a vast majority of protests, things are getting worse, and things are at a level where community is feeling more and more frustrated. I mean, last night the tactics they used it was kind of just a bizarre tactic that I've never personally seen before, but they had riot police push us back into bicycle police. So the bicycle police were blocking off the street, and then you had Walmart on one side, buildings on the other, and the riot police pushing you, telling you to get back, and there was no getting back. You were going to run into the police line. And when you got to that police line, people started to panic. And it's usually weird. I usually have press passes with me, and last night I didn't have those passes, and talk about how scary it is for a lot of people to be at them. I'm a tall white male in America with a press badge, and I'm like pretty scared in these situations. And imagine being a person of color in those situations that are braving it. But we're out there, we're in between the two lines, and usually they'll let people go right away, and they didn't let anyone go. A few people panic, they try to jump over the bicycles, the cops hit those people, spray pepper spray. And then after about 2 minutes of kind of everyone just not knowing what to do, they let us out through one choke point. About 2 cops kind of moved aside, and we all flush out. And as we're flushing out, including my friend Wyatt, who is wearing press badges, the police begin to sporadically pepper spray people, almost at random, as they're just kind of walking out to move down Georgia Avenue. And so I hear kind of the mix of what I'm learning now is a kind of long-term, give them the benefit of the doubt, but things are getting worse. We can't give them the benefit of the doubt. Things are going to get worse. So Samantha, I'm curious how you're seeing, like, what is the next, to ask you what the next year looks like, ask you in January 2020 what this year would look like. How do we think beyond maybe this kind of reform commission and try to get ahead of the curve? How do we think ahead and work ahead?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you, and for everyone else for being like out on the streets last night. I think that example, unfortunately or fortunately, it just shows what this next year has ahead of us and what we can expect in this next year. We are in, DC is a police state at this point, and they are using militarized tactics to suppress our voice in many ways. And I know Karan, I saw that Karan's mother was among one of the people who were pepper sprayed after identifying herself as his mother. I do think all of this is culture shift. The way policing is in our country, we have all been conditioned to think about police in the same way, regardless of who you are, your race, your identity. We have all been conditioned to think that police are here to protect and serve, that police and the state more broadly will act with good intent and in our best interest, despite how much that contradicts with our actual lived experiences, right? As a Black person, I can tell you that I do not feel safe around police. I can tell you that police do not protect me. And at the same time, I am also like constantly like unpacking and unlearning what I've been told about police. It's like, oh no, Samantha, you must be wrong. You must be like imagining things. And that's just a constant that we're dealing with. And so because of that, I think it is going to need continued pressure. More and more people, even with doubts, like even with you all on this call, if you're not completely like invested in abolition, for people to still speak up and call it like there is something wrong here, right? Like we know police are causing harm to our neighbors, to our community members, and that can no longer occur. Whatever the path is to getting that done, like for people to have extremely strong stances against a police state and against police violence, and being willing to speak out about those stances, regardless of whether or not you have all of the answers, if that makes sense. And I know people are not always comfortable with doing that, but that is how we start changing culture, because that's how we start having those really difficult, at times intimate conversations with people who are closest to us, and that's going to start changing their hearts and minds. Really specific to council, there, as I mentioned earlier, there are people working on the collective bargaining agreement. some of the things in terms of like firing, accountability, use of force, all of those things are laid out in that collective bargaining agreement. It is scary. It is terrifying how much power that contract and the police union more broadly has in this city. And so in some ways, not to give them any type of room or credit, but in some ways our city leaders' hands are tied when they negotiate a agreement that doesn't serve our best interests. And by ours, I mean the Black and Brown community's best interests. So it's a collective bargaining agreement. It is going to be a combination of both budget, that divestment, as well as policy and practice changes. We are calling for defund as a path to abolition, but defund, that idea of like slowly, incrementally pulling back funds from policing, allows us to start building up those infrastructures so that, we're not going to blink our eye after a budget is passed and there's not going to be any police on our street. So it's about how do we start defunding police, using those dollars and redirecting them to other bills to start building those infrastructures. And then what are the other strategies? So there are people, when we talk about dismantling policing infrastructure, we talk about deprioritizing, So police can no longer arrest people for minor offenses. That's an example of deprioritizing, or sex work, for example, That's an example of deprioritizing. We talk about divestment. So that's largely the defund, start intentionally pulling dollars away from policing and redirecting that to building the infrastructure of what we actually need in this city. There's also disarming, So there's like all these tactics. There's disarming, there's demilitarizing. So there's all of these ways, all as a pathway to dismantle, that we're going to have to see happen in radical ways, I think, in this next year, in order for me to have some type of hope that things are going to change. And why I think this next year is key is because now is actually the opportunity where we have to explore and experiment with all these things, We're in a pandemic, crime, Like crime doesn't look the same. People aren't going to schools or going to work buildings the same way they used to. There's all of these things that are different about our lives. And we're all forced to reimagine and change our daily habits. So now is the time when we choose that this new normal we're going back to isn't the normal that we came from, Isn't the status quo. We have consistent police violence happening in our own backyards. We have the 16,000 people who have been activated in this moment locally at a local level. So I do believe that people need to explicitly call on our city leaders to do all those forms of dismantling in order for us to get from point A to point G, maybe. And that's beyond the commission. And hopefully the commission will put forth recommendations that are aligned with that. I told you all earlier on the call, I would love for that to happen. I still am in constant back and forth doubt of what will come from the commission. But we know power concedes nothing without demand. And so that consistent push is going to be necessary. And for people to follow the lead of Black organizers, and for those who have questions, again, to still speak out. Even if you're not all bought into abolition, I can't say it enough. We need to acknowledge the harm that police are causing in our backyards and across the country, but especially in our backyards.
I have been itching to say something. The first thing I'm going to say is going to make everybody mad, but I don't like the idea that the police unions, or our particular police union, is getting so much of the blame. I have to admit, my career has been in the labor movement, and my career has been with management always saying, the union made me do it. The militaristic structure is the management. The police union is a defense mechanism for one group. And so anyway, I would just say, don't get hung up on that one. Second, DC is in the process of trying to become a state. And until a year ago, nobody looked at what do we have to change to become a state. We can't just wake up one day and be a state and not have thought through what do we have to pay for? How do we restructure our taxes? And it's a big thing. So who's working on this? The Federal City Council, which is the big mucky mucks in town, basically white men with a couple of big mucky muck black men. But they've got money to spend. So they are farming out research projects. They have, I think, 2 full-time staffers. If we're gonna make any serious attempt to redesign our society, we are going to need to be given serious money and staff. The idea that there's somebody now assigned to help with research is wonderful. You need more of it. But the other thing is, seems to me that police-free schools ought to be easy. It's not, but it ought to be. And if we could say, let's do that first, that we could build a model that then we can apply it someplace else. So I know that some of the organizations have ideas of how you make schools safe and caring without having cops and metal detectors. So could we try that one first?
Yes. Yes, police-free schools, again, should be easy. It has not been easy. We have been, and I do think the Defund Coalition here in DC has done pretty well in like connecting the dots and saying, you know, like we can remove, when we're talking about defund, we're talking about removing police-free schools. We're talking about decriminalizing sex work, right? They're like naming really specific ways that feel like they should be like easier for people to conceptualize. But it hasn't worked because that same fear exists, regardless of what we're talking about, right? Because again, policing is like, we are socially conditioned to think about policing in a certain way. So regardless of where we're talking about policing, the problem still exists. And there's this dynamic of young people now, right? That like goes hand in hand that I think is making it worse. The other reason why we don't just move forward with police-free schools and like leave the larger defund alone is because for us, for Black Swan Academy, and I would say like the larger national like police-free schools movement, we have learned through experience that when we don't come out as naming police-free schools as part of an abolitionist movement, that it stops there, right? And oftentimes a lot of the things that we talk about in the police-free schools movement can be held against the larger abolitionist movement. And so making sure in the very beginning that those two things are intrinsically tied is important for that reason, and also because the solution doesn't just stand in school, it is also a community solution, right? The reason why people, one of the reasons, if we're saying people are good intended, that people believe police belong in schools is because they'll say there's so much community violence. And so we need police in our schools to make sure that community violence doesn't feed into our schools. One of the arguments, not saying I buy it, but the abolitionist framework will say, okay, sure, there's community violence, and which is why we need, right, to talk about community solutions that don't include police. So those two things just kind of go hand in hand and are intrinsically tied. When it comes to the union, I'm gonna drop this. I feel the pushback on the union, right? As an organizer, right? Most organizers learn their work from studying the labor movement, and police unions I do not believe are a part of the labor movement. And there's a number of really good articles and think pieces that you can read around that. In DC, we have seen the police union, even without police officers, like going extremely hard against any type of reform that happens in policing in DC, including like things around use of force, things around accountability. The police union has not been, I don't think they've been working on the behalf of the police officers themselves or in the larger context. I think if they were a part of the labor movement, every other union should be completely disappointed and disheartened by them.
Yeah, you're right.
Kent, do you want to add anything either to Bob's question and reflections from earlier, or what we just heard from Anne or Samantha's responses?
I'm going to be honest. Bob may need to rephrase a little. It's been a spell since Bob spoke. Although
I guess the thing, Ken, and I appreciate you talking about kind of the learning process you're going. I think for white people especially, we just need to challenge ourselves to do more, to learn more. I mean, even little things like it's at the ANC meetings, the things we've normalized. When the police walk into an ANC meeting, we stop the meeting, police right to the front, come speak, don't need a microphone, you guys have the floor, yes sir, everything you say. We had an incident at the ANC meeting, I'm sure you remember last, where they'd come in and they said, we're looking for 3 or 4 young Hispanic males in a black car. If anybody sees them, we're not profiling. That's just, we just saw it. We saw a car, a couple young. And 2 nights before that, I was with a group of activists from the Vendedores Unidos at the 3rd District headquarters, and the police refused to meet with those Hispanic, Latino community members. So to have them deny that meeting, but then 2 days later, we open up the ANC meeting and say, come on in, whatever you have to say. It's stuff like that you just until the scales start to fall off your eyes, do you realize how much it's stuff I do too in my daily life. And so that's kind of what I was just reflecting on my own journey. And I appreciate you going on that journey with us as well.
No, I agree with that. I think that, and if I can say that the pandemic has had some silver linings, I wouldn't say that there are many, but it's challenged me to rethink a lot of how society works, because it's not anything like it was. And so there's been a lot of listening. There's been a lot of self-reflection. There's been a need to embrace grace. I think that a lot of people in the virtual environment in particular are getting frustrated with being homebound, or being frustrated with their lives being turned upside down, and aren't necessarily their better selves when they interact with their community members in a virtual environment. And so I will say I'm starting to come to just about every engagement from a position of, it needs to start with listening and respecting every single perspective, because, and Bob, to your point, being, just for the rest of you, having grown up about 45 minutes from where Bob grew up, you know that in that part of the Midwest, that, being a white male, you probably don't fear for just about anything, because the chances of any interaction with a police officer being a bad interaction is slim and none. I mean, even if you have done something heinous that deserves you to be pulled over, that's just not like the world I grew up in. And I recognize that my experiences are from a place of privilege, from a different type of community, and that much of what needs to be dismantled was put in place to ensure that that kind of community moves forward at the expense of Black and Brown community. and our neighbors, right? And so that does not need to be dismantled. And many, well, let's just say everybody who grew up in a similar situation, like we are going to have to get uncomfortable with the reality. And I say uncomfortable because change is always uncomfortable. But we also intellectually know that there's a lot of power and control that just needs to be let go of, right? If we're truly concerned with society being a whole body that's good for everybody, and that there's equity, and that we have to recognize 400 years of inequity, and getting us to a place where public safety isn't just for those who are born into privilege, but public safety is about everybody, as is generational wealth and everything else, then we have to dismantle the system and start over. And I think that, again, I'm rambling, but I don't think those are things that we need to, well, let me rephrase it. I don't always speak the most eloquently when I'm just free flowing my thoughts. But I think that many people are going to have to get very uncomfortable very quickly if we're going to dismantle the way the world has worked and put it back to the way that it should have always worked. But I'll leave it at that. But I'll leave it at that and still say I'm very open to, challenging myself, learning, being a positive part of where we need to go.
Thanks, Kent. And Samantha dropped into the chat an article about why police unions are not part of the labor movement. And so I linked to that in the notes, and that'll go out after as well, or you can just open it there on your computer if you see her chat. Thanks, Samantha, for adding that.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion within the labor movement about, do we want to disown police unions? They are very separate. They get used on us when we're on strike someplace or demonstrating. So it's, it's true. But I still think management agreed to everything that's in that contract.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's in the negotiation.
Yep. And management, the DC MPD is horrendous in the way they treat the officers.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and not only like the management of MPD, but right, the contract has to be agreed on by the mayor and by the city council.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah.
Yep.
So as we kind of wrap up here in the next few minutes, we've had some great recommendations from you all about how to keep the community involved, whether that is just being in the street and protesting, or being willing to stand up and speak out for what this change needs to look like. But I just want to open it up. And as we think about the Police Reform Commission and the recommendations, either on the December timeline or perhaps on an extended timeline, when Kent and I are talking to our constituents and Bob's talking to members of the community that he works with on a regular basis, like, what's the message about how to get involved with the Police Reform Commission and how to make sure that we see our values reflected in those recommendations? We heard from Ron last time that all the meetings, all the committee meetings are public. So I think he had suggested one avenue, like if you really care about police in schools or removal of police in schools, then, maybe focus your efforts on that one. Or maybe there's another committee that you want to get involved with. But that question is for both of you.
Well, I can say what I'd like to see. you know, one thing I really liked, although I will say I was disappointed more people didn't engage and provide feedback. Layla, if you recall, when we did the comprehensive plan review, one thing that I really liked is that when we got to the point of writing draft recommendations, we put the drafts up and made them publicly available. And I have voiced this to the two committees I'm on, as well as our co-chairs, that what I would like to see is when we get to the point where we're starting to draft documents, I would personally love to have them publicly available on our websites so that people can see what we're working on. If they think we're going in the wrong direction or they think we can do a better job, that I would like to see them be able to provide feedback so that we can get that in some kind of semblance of real time and perhaps make those adjustments. And then what I would also like to see prior to lifting up those recommendations from the committee level to the main body is I would love the committee to have a public listening session or some kind of public event where we can hear directly from the broader community that can then tell us if they think we've missed something, if they think that we misunderstood something, you know, but to me, there has to be a conversation. And the one thing I have heard from, I'll say, constituents and neighbors that there is concern is that when they look at the 20 people that are on the commission, they're not seeing a lot of like average citizen, right? I mean, and let's face it, people were chosen for various strengths. And so that concern is, how does the average resident get their voice heard too? And I think that then becomes on our shoulders that we have to make space for that. And so I've been thinking about it. Clearly, I think anyone who knows me can like reach out to me and tell me anything they want to tell me at any time. But you know, relying on that is going to miss a lot of people. So I think there has to be a broader process to make sure that as many voices are heard as need to be heard, especially when many of the voices that need to be heard frequently aren't. And so we have to recognize as well, when we're paying attention to who's reaching out, we should be looking specifically for the voices we aren't hearing and not presume that those voices have nothing to say, but ask ourselves, have we not created a process for the voices we need to hear the loudest?
The,
Thanks,
a
Samantha.
of the people who live in my building would be outraged if they heard what we were saying. They want more cops, you know, more vicious cops. And I don't know, I sure don't know how to deal with them.
Something about you cooking while you're saying this kind of makes it feel lighter.
I literally was thinking, like, is this why you want us to come back for dinner? We can like have a therapy session on how to talk to neighbors.
Yeah.
So I do think, so one thing that we'll continue to offer, and at some point we'll have to figure out like a better way to do this. I'm going to continue to talk about policing as a form of social conditioning. And so I understand that many of your neighbors, right, many of my neighbors who are Black also will disagree with me on the solutions I'm making. And I have found though, that when you create safe, dedicated, intentional spaces to talk about the history of policing, to talk about the concerns and the harm of policing, both to people of color, but as well as to white people, right? Like everyone is a victim of systemic racism. Everyone is a victim of a policing infrastructure that is intended to oppress other people. And so when you start creating spaces to have those conversations and then give people room to imagine a world without police, you would be surprised as how quickly people start to shift their thinking, right? It's about like pushing people to curiosity, not necessarily like creating, no one's an abolitionist overnight, at least I was not an abolitionist overnight. And so that's the goal, like creating safe spaces with people who are in close proximity to you to have those conversations and to like do that learning and unlearning. And so the offer is, if I could be helpful, or if any organizer who I'm in relationship with could be helpful in having those conversations, I'm more than willing to do that. Like host a Zoom. It's kind of easy to do now. Host a Zoom call. Happy to pop on and talk to folk and grapple with you all.
That's great. It's so funny because I just finished 2 days of anti-racist training, and the talk was about the uncomfortable conversations. And in my head, it was always talking to African Americans, but the uncomfortable conversations for me would be with white people in the building.
And that's the real work. Like, we don't need you all to talk to Black people about policing in communities. Like, what's going to help us is like you all having the conversations with your white friends and family members and neighbors.
Yeah.
I call it unproductive discomfort, or productive discomfort.
Yep.
Samantha, in addition to what you just shared about creating spaces for those initial conversations, as you think about the recommendations coming out of the commission, and sort of what Kent threw out there in terms of opportunity for public comment or public listening sessions, did you have any reflections or anything to add on that piece?
What Kent said, I think we need to work within the, I think it's on the commissioners to create intentional spaces to get that feedback. I think for community members, finding that subcommittee, like Ron mentioned, finding that subcommittee and paying attention to that. Although I wouldn't want to spend my time like I don't necessarily want to spend my time in these subcommittee meetings, so don't imagine other people do. And could be beneficial if folk have the capacity to submit something in writing or make a video of kind of like their experiences, especially those who have negative interactions or who are just like have some creative solutions. If they want to submit written testimony or video testimony, for lack of a better term, for like the subcommittees and commission members to like review and sit with and discuss. That thinking about the Police Free Schools subcommittee, I'm also on the violence reduction and prevention subcommittee. That seems like a better use of people's time and a way to have things like publicly on record.
I was also wondering, as you were talking, if it were possible to create some kind of, I'll call it portal for lack of a better thing, but like the ability to provide feedback, right? Like if you went to our website, if you went to the Police Reform Commission website and you could put in a comment, but with essentially share your experience, and then someone at our end could take that and feed it to the correct committee or committees, because it's probably going to fall into a couple of different areas. But yeah. You know, again, I think one thing that's key is trying to find trying to reduce barriers to participation as much as possible in a way that's as safe as possible. Because some of the stories that need to be shared, some of the experiences that need to be shared, unless people understand that it's a safe space, they may not be shared. And how do you do that entirely in a virtual environment? I'm not sure, but I think it's incumbent upon us to figure it out.
Yeah, and probably soon.
Probably last week.
I'll follow up on the email if you want to send an email to Blaine. I'll support that effort.
I can do that.
But I do think that part about the safe space, because in reality, it's not a safe space, right? Like the police officers MPD is on every single call that we have. Even our subcommittee calls, MPD is on there. And so, especially for Police Free Schools and even the violence prevention, where so often we have this false narrative, this false binary of like the victim versus a perpetrator, right? Is that many people who are experiencing violence, many people who are impacted most by police resources are people who are systems involved already. And when we're talking about lifting up the voices of the young people or the people who are at the margins of the margins, we're talking about people who are systems involved, who are court involved, who are immigrant or undocumented. And the reality is it's not a safe space for them, no matter how much we want it to be. And so what does that look like what does it look like for their voices to still be able to be heard? And I don't have the answer, but want to find the answer.
Rose posted in the chat before she had to hop off, Kojo Nandi show, and have a call-in where people can share their stories or have comments submitted on social media. Yeah, there's probably a lot of different avenues. Can you write letters? I don't think anyone wants to go back and review the 15,000 testimonies that were already submitted, but I feel like there's probably really good content within those submissions that the commission could look at.
Well, Impact Justice could read through.
I was just gonna say, Impact Justice could do that.
I don't know who these people are, but have them review 15,000 testimonies and get that to the appropriate committees.
We're paying them with city dollars, so they should do the work.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'm happy to wrap up here. If anyone has just final thoughts before we hop off. Oh, Samantha wants to know, since you all grew up within 45 minutes of each other, Kent and Bob, where did you grow up?
Well, if memory serves, I don't want to speak for Bob. Do you want to go first?
I'm from Rockford, Illinois.
Yeah.
Town about 150,000 people, and interesting to compare and contrast. The same landmass as Washington, D.C., but a fourth of the size, but does also serve as an outlier for a lot of long-term racial and class issues that we see across America, but just a lot of violence that we also see here in Washington, D.C. in a different setting. But that's where I'm from, yeah.
Yeah, and I grew up 45 minutes to the east in a small town called Harvard, which was about 5,200 people when I was growing up. Its claim to fame is a fiberglass Holstein cow in the middle of town. I could give you the background of that if you care about Holstein cows.
I'm curious, but it's okay. My second question was, do you all, so my hometown is Pittsburgh. I don't know if I said that. Do you all consider Pittsburgh to be in the Midwest?
No.
Well, it's on the west side of the Alleghenies, so I would consider that it's part of the Ohio Valley.
Which would make it the Midwest. I do not consider it part of the Midwest, but when I left Pittsburgh, apparently most people outside of Pittsburgh do.
Well, since you're going to go down that road, my husband's from Kansas, and he will tell you he's from the Midwest, and I will correct him every time and tell him he's from the Plains, because the Midwest does not cross the Mississippi.
Geography, okay. I'm always asking.
Well, no, it's the wackadoodle way. It's the whole manifest destiny, the growth of the country. Like if you look at what these names, where they first get used and what parts of the country they're referring to, like the Southwest is Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama, and then as it grows, for instance, in Library of Congress subject headings, if you want Arizona, New Mexico, it's going to be Southwest, new, because that's the new Southwest, versus the Pacific states. So Northwest is Minnesota. So this is all kind of, we're coming up with these geographic names before we've actually purchased Louisiana. So it's weird.
It was before my time.
Yeah. So I've now wasted everyone's time with something that's perhaps you can pull out at your next social gathering when you work the room, but it's not going to get you anywhere in life.
I started it. I appreciate you all entertaining my questions around the Midwest.
I just want to say Virgil Abloh, Michelle Williams, the Sock Monkey, and the Rockford Peaches are all from Rockford, Illinois. I led with the Bonds because that's where my mind is right now. Cheap Trick. I just want to shout out some of the things that.
Like, for the record, we have some good things.
Yeah, there's some good things there too. My family's there, my people's, but we also have the same issues that we talk about here.
Yeah.
Good things as well too. So thanks for asking though. I can talk your ear off about Rockford, just like hometown love there.
I get it.
Yeah, cool.
All right, I'm gonna go eat dinner. I'm happy to leave the Zoom open if you guys want to keep talking about Library of Congress designations. Otherwise, I so appreciate seeing your beautiful faces and having some challenging conversations, and look forward to continuing this in the future.
Very cool. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, peace.
Good night.